Well, welcome to this seminar on shoulder stability and how we can take what we learn, creating stable shoulders for weight bearing, and improve the way our neck and our shoulders feel outside of our yoga practice and off our yoga mat. So, I'm going to share a slideshow here with some slides pulled out of the Yoga Medicine 55-hour shoulder intensive, which obviously dives in a lot more detail into the shoulder. So know that whenever we talk about really anything, but anatomy in this case, there's always an awful lot more to learn. So I'll be presenting a relatively simple model. And I just want you to know in advance that there's always a lot more complexity and nuance going on. We kind of break things down into a simplified system to help us understand them, knowing that there's always a little more going on behind the scenes. So here we are getting ready to talk about shoulder stability and the key considerations to optimize the shoulder position when we're weight bearing on our hands. I'm going to start by talking about the structure and function of the shoulder joints because we can't really isolate form and function. How something is shaped, how it's made really does impact how we can use it and work with it in our lives. We'll talk about some of the key muscles for shoulder stability. If you're anything like I was before I started studying anatomy, they won't all be familiar to you. And that's part of the challenge, I think, when it comes to the shoulders, the kind of mystery and the unfamiliarity. And I'll talk a little about some more familiar muscles that we'd then layer on top of these ones. We'll talk about some really common muscle patterns in the shoulders. Everybody's different. We all have our own unique habits and patterns, but there are some common tendencies that we tend to see either in ourselves, or if we're healthcare professionals or yoga teachers, we might see them in our patients or our students. We'll talk about shoulder function off the mat because, of course, we're not always weight bearing on our hands on our yoga mat. There are plenty of times when we aren't and we're walking around in our lives. So we need to take what we learn in yoga practice and apply it to the rest of our day and week as well. And then I'll talk a little about the Yoga Medicine 55-hour shoulder intensive for those of you who are thinking about diving in to study a little bit further, just to give you a taste of some of the topics that you'll cover. And I'll open it up at the end to your questions. So if any questions come up or come to mind through the course of the seminar, don't hesitate to pop your questions into that chat function. And even if they're answered by the content later, that's fine. Just takes a little while to type, so feel free to capture them while you're thinking of them. So let's start by looking at the structure and the function of the shoulder joints. And you can see from the image here that we've got multiple pretty shallow joints. When we talk about the shoulder complex, we're talking about the upper arm bone or humerus, the shoulder blade or scapula, and also the collarbone or the clavicle. And these three bones together create a kind of convoluted, zigzagging weight-bearing pathway between the hand and the core of the body, the axial skeleton. So if we trace that weight-bearing pathway, we come across quite a few different joints. The main shoulder joint, the one that we usually think about when we're talking about shoulder movements, is called the glenohumeral joint. Don't get too bamboozled by the anatomical terminology. It's just the joint between the humerus and this little shallow socket that I'll show you in a moment, the glenoid fossa. So glenoid fossa, humerus, glenohumeral joint. There are also very shallow joints here between the outside of the shoulder blade and the clavicle, the acromion and the clavicle, the AC joint, and here between the clavicle and the sternum, the SC joint. And you could also think about the positioning of the shoulder blade being a sort of informal joint as well. So let me show you on Fred. So if we're carrying weight on our hands here, the force of that weight, the load, travels through the lower arm, mostly through the larger lower arm bone, the radius, through this upper arm bone, the humerus, and it meets the glenoid fossa, that very shallow little socket that I spoke about here, which connects to the head of the humerus. And we've got a large head and a small socket, which allows the humerus to move really freely in all directions. And that's important because the primary characteristic of our hands is dexterity, the capacity for our hands to move around and allow us to do all of the things that we need to do to work, to eat, to care for our young, to hunt, all of that sort of stuff. So the glenohumeral joint is the first junction here between the upper arm bone and the shoulder blade. The shoulder blade is one of my favorite bones in the body, but it's pretty complicated. So we've got this kind of slightly rounded dish shape that fits onto the back ribs. And as I said, we could think about this junction between the shoulder blade and the rib cage as being like an informal joint. Because in Fred, the shoulder blade is bolted in place, but in our bodies, of course, the shoulder blades can move around in all directions. So even though this isn't a classic joint, there's no joint capsule involved, there is movement between the rib cage and the shoulder blade. So the shoulder blade is mostly on the back of the body, but right at the outer edge of the shoulders, the shoulder blade kind of flips over into a horizontal shelf, right where our shoulder pads would go. And we call this horizontal shelf the acromion. I mentioned it before. There's a junction here between the collarbone and the acromion, the AC joint. You can see it's just like a little finger almost sitting, barely touching that flat shelf. And then we have another joint here between the clavicle and the sternum, where that convoluted weight-bearing pathway runs from hand through humerus, through shoulder blade and into the acromion, through the clavicle, into the sternum, and into the core of the body. And I'd like you to contrast that for a moment to the hip joint, where we've got the head of the thigh bone, the femur, sitting pretty deep into this socket called the acetabulum. So in the hip, we've got two bones meeting, quite a lot of surface area between the two bones, and that gives the hip some inherent stability. And that's why I can stand here and talk really comfortably. And if I were to try and teach this in a handstand, it would be a completely different story. We can train our bodies to do pretty much anything, but when we look at their form, we can see that the hip joint has some inherent stability, high level of surface area between the bones, and the shoulder joint is made a little differently. It's a little bit more mobile. So we've got multiple shallow joints, and together these give the shoulder its function of high mobility, that capacity to move our hands through space to create that dexterity. What it also means, though, is that when we come to yoga practice and we start to carry our body weight on our hands, while stability is something that we can learn, it's just not something that we can assume. Most of the students that come to yoga practice can walk pretty comfortably on their hips, so we can assume some level of standing stability. We just can't assume that for the shoulders. Now, the shoulders, as I said, are highly mobile, and all of that movement comes from 2 points, from the glenohumeral joint, the movement of the humerus or upper arm bone, and from the movement of the shoulder blade against the back ribs. So when it comes to the movement of the humerus, we've got abduction and adduction, flexion and extension, internal and external rotation. So we can take this humerus into abduction, the arm moving away from the midline of the body, adduction toward or across the midline of the body. We've got flexion, where the arm bone moves in front of the body, and extension, where it moves behind. He's not very good at external rotation and internal rotation, but I'll give you an idea. Internal rotation is the humerus turning toward the midline of the body, and external is the humerus turning away from the midline of the body. So internal and external. So the humerus, incredibly mobile in all planes, forward, sideways, backwards, rotation, giving our hands a lot of that dexterity. And then when we add on to that the movement of the shoulder blades themselves sliding around in the rib cage, you can see how the function of the shoulders is to create this really wide swath of movement for the arms. So the shoulder blades move up toward the ears and down toward the waist. Elevation is up toward the ears. Depression is down toward the waist. Protraction, where the shoulder blades move away from the spine to wrap around the side ribs, and retraction is the opposite, where the shoulder blades squeeze back toward the spine. And then upward and downward rotation accompany this abduction of the upper arm bone. So as we take our arms out wide and up toward the ceiling, our shoulder blades upwardly rotate. This glenoid fossa, rather than pointing out toward the sides, points up toward the ceiling or up towards our fingertips. And then we can downwardly rotate back to the starting position. So when it comes to stabilizing the shoulders, we need those 2 points to be stable. This highly mobile glenohumeral joint needs to create a stable position, and also the shoulder blade needs to be held relatively static in relation to the rib cage to give us stability on our hands. Otherwise, the arm bone will be moving around or the shoulder blade will be moving around, and we won't have that really stable position. So for the humeral stabilizers, we talk about the rotator cuff, which is a group of small, deep, probably unfamiliar muscles that juggle the position of the head of the humerus in relation to the glenoid fossa. When it comes to stabilizing the shoulder blades or scapula, we're looking at the rhomboids and serratus anterior, or depending on your pronunciation, serratus anterior. So let's look at the rotator cuff first of all. And I really like this image because this is really how we can think of the rotator cuff. It's a group of 4 individual muscles, but they really function like one little muscular cuff. So we're looking here at the side of the body, and the very head of the upper arm bone here, the very head of the humerus. There's the acromion there, that little bony outcrop of the shoulder blade. So this is the back of the body, the posterior body. And then we've got this little forward jutting of the shoulder blade here on the front of the body. So this is the anterior body. And you can see the 4 muscles almost looking like one cuff. They're not sort of clearly delineated, but one muscular cuff that barely crosses over that glenohumeral joint to snuggle the head of the humerus a little closer to the glenoid fossa, or a little closer to the outer edge of the shoulder blade. And depending on which muscle is working, that will fine tune the position up, down, forward, or back. So the rotator cuff muscles, you don't really need to remember the individual names of for the purposes of this discussion, but know that subscapularis or subscapularis is here on the front of the body, kind of filling in the front portion that's sort of hollow at the front of the shoulder blade. Supraspinatus or supraspinatus, depending on your pronunciation, sits here at the top, running right underneath the acromion, kind of diving underneath it like a subway or a submarine. And then on the back, we have infraspinatus and a smaller kind of mirror image doing the same thing of teres minor. So infraspinatus or infraspinatus here, and teres minor doing a very similar job to catch the back of the head of the humerus. Now, these 2 muscles I'll talk about a little bit later as being a very important counter to the natural tendency of the shoulder. The natural tendency of the shoulder is to move toward the front of the body, and infraspinatus and teres minor are our external rotators. They catch the head of the humerus and they roll it back toward the center of its socket, or at least they roll it toward the back of the body. And if our starting position is a forward position, they'll bring it back to neutral. So these tissues on the back of the shoulder create a really important counter to the natural tendency of our shoulders, especially within the demands of modern life. So if you're going to remember one muscle in the rotator cuff for today, remember infraspinatus or infraspinatus, sitting right here on the back of the shoulder blade. Small muscle, deep muscle. For most of us, these are unfamiliar. We can't really feel them or connect to them unless they're feeling irritated, for example. But they're doing very important work to juggle the position of the head of the upper arm bone. So that was the first point that needed to be stabilized, this highly mobile head of the humerus. The second were the shoulder blades. Oh, I'll show you this image first. So here's the anterior view, the front view of the shoulder blade, subscapularis filling that whole dish, that little hollow on the front of the shoulder blade. There's the upper arm bone, there's the acromion. And then the posterior view, the back view, you can see infraspinatus or infraspinatus here. Supraspinatus or supraspinatus at the top is the back of the head of the humerus. Just to give you an idea that these rotator cuff muscles pretty much cover the shoulder blade and then barely cross over the joint. Not strong levers, just fine tuning the position of the upper arm bone. So onto those scapular stabilizers. We have 2 muscles that work in sort of cooperative opposition. So the rhomboids run here in this left-hand image between the spine. Cannot get my mouse to stay in one place. Between the spine and the inner border of the shoulder blade or scapula. So if you imagine these muscles, and there's a minor and a major, but we'll just think of them as one rhomboid shape, a sort of square that's leaning a little bit to one side. You can imagine if that muscle shortened, that it would catch the inner border of the shoulder blade and pull it closer to the spine. And that was the movement that we spoke about earlier as being retraction, catching the inner borders of the shoulder blades and squeezing them closer to the spine. In yoga practice, you might experience that as heart opening, this feeling of the collarbones broadening, the sternum lifting, the chest becoming more open or more spacious. So, this muscle we know already is going to play a really important role in balancing the tendency of the shoulders to come forward by pulling the whole shoulder complex toward the back of the body and creating that heart opening feeling. And in most of us, this muscle's pretty strong. You can try it in your own body, squeeze your shoulder blades back towards your spine. This muscle is a little more superficial, it's a bit closer to the skin. So most of us will feel a kind of palpable, noticeable contraction. We'll be able to get in touch with that feeling. The trouble is, it often fatigues pretty quickly. So we've got the shoulder blades pulled back, we feel that strong and vigorous contraction. And pretty quickly, for me, as soon as I think about anything else, pretty much the shoulders start to drift back to their starting position. So, not necessarily a weak muscle, but one that we can forget to engage or that can fatigue fairly quickly. Now, working in opposition to the rhomboids in sort of cooperative competition is serratus anterior or serratus anterior. And this is one that for most of us is a lot more difficult to get in touch with, less familiar. I hadn't heard of it before I started studying anatomy. So it's in the right hand image here, and it starts in exactly the same place, that inner border of the shoulder blades, and runs in the opposite direction toward the side ribs. So it's actually fitting into the space between the shoulder blades and the back ribs, catching that inner border of the shoulder blades and connecting them to the lateral surfaces of the upper ribs, almost all the ribs, the upper sort of 8 or 9 ribs. So you can imagine that if this muscle shortened, if those muscle fibers contracted, they would catch the inner border of the shoulder blade and pull it away from the spine to wrap around the rib cage and move closer to the side ribs. And that was the movement that we called protraction. So if we're reaching our arms out in front of us to push something away and we're stretching the skin between the shoulder blades on the back of the body, that's the action of protraction. That's the action of serratus anterior or serratus anterior. So if we imagine those muscles here on my skeleton thread, and I'll use my little clicker here so that you can see the shoulder blade a little more clearly. I've got the rhomboids here connecting the shoulder blades to the spine, and then I've got serratus anterior here running from the side ribs to grab onto the shoulder blade in the other position. So if the rhomboids contract, they're going to pull the shoulder blade closer to the spine. And if serratus anterior contracts, it's going to pull the shoulder blade in the other direction, away from the spine to kind of circle around the side ribs. What if both of them contract at the same time? Well, if both of those muscles are trying to pull the shoulder blade in opposite directions and their actions are balanced, the rhomboids aren't winning, serratus anterior isn't winning, but they're pinning the shoulder blade in place, they're effectively going to stabilize that scapulothoracic joint, that informal joint between the shoulder blade and the rib cage. So that's going to be a really important starting step to hold the whole shoulder complex in place, to kind of hold the shoulder blade still in relation to the rib cage, so that those smaller, deeper rotator cuff muscles can then fine tune the position of the head of the shoulder and the socket. Because remember, that socket is part of the shoulder blade. So if we can keep the shoulder blade steady and still, the glenoid fossa is still, and the only remaining challenge then is to juggle the head of the humerus up, down, forward, or back using those smaller, deeper rotator cuff muscles. So if you're with me so far, we'll carry on. So when we're weight bearing on the hands, as we often do in yoga practice, we can use a series of 4 cues to help us get all of these muscles plus some extras engaged. So as I said, we've got these smaller, deeper muscles, the rotator cuff, juggling the position of the head of the humerus here. We've got more superficial muscles, bigger muscles like the rhomboids here and serratus anterior here. But of course, we've got lots of other muscles layered on the top, including more familiar muscles like the triceps on the backs of the upper arms, the lats that run kind of this back strip of the armpit, connecting the upper arm bone down to the lower back. We've got the traps here, the upper trapezius for most of us, this familiar mass on the tops of the shoulders that tends to get a bit tight and a bit tense. And then the lower traps or lower trapezius running to finish off that sort of diamond shape. And on the front of the body, on top of these deeper muscles, we've got the mass of the pecs, this sort of familiar, strong chest muscle on the front. So as well as those smaller, deeper muscles doing their work, we need some of the bigger, more superficial muscles to kick in as well. As I said, we create a sort of simplified model, but the reality is that all of the muscles of the body tend to cooperate and coordinate. And while we think of the rotator cuff as being the primary positioners of the head of the humerus, other muscles will participate too. And while we think of the rhomboids and serratus anterior or serratus anterior as being the primary stabilizers for the shoulder blades, they'll get some help from other muscles as well. So when it comes to weight bearing on the hands, we can use these 4 cues to get a ring of support all the way around the shoulder complex. And there's a reason why I'm doing a seminar on shoulder stability and why we don't tend to do seminars on hip stability unless we're trying to stand on one foot or on tiptoes or keep a steady position while we're moving through space. And that there's a lot more mindfulness involved in creating that stability in the shoulders. Firstly, because they're such inherently mobile joints. That's their nature, to move our arms through varied positions to allow us to function in our lives. And secondly, because many of the muscles that coordinate the shoulder joints are unfamiliar. They're muscles that we can't vigorously contract the way we can, say, the glutes, the buttock muscles, or the quads, the thigh muscles. Most of us have heard of the primary muscles of the hips, like the psoas or the hamstrings, but the muscles around the shoulder are a little bit less familiar, a little bit more mysterious. And so adding that to the mobile nature of the joints, I think some real thought and attention are required, especially in yoga practice, which tends to attract students who are more mobile than the average, who have more of a capacity to move the upper arm bone, perhaps, or more of a capacity to move the shoulder blades. And so this mindful connection to often unfamiliar muscles can be really key. So step 1 is to take the head of the humerus, to take the shoulder and hug it down and in to the joint. And a couple of muscles will coordinate here, but primarily we're thinking about the front of the rotator cuff, snuggling the head of the humerus a little bit closer to that glenoid fossa, or creating a more sturdy connection there. The second one is to push forward or to push the floor away if our hands are on the floor, to take the shoulder blades and wrap them around the side ribs, or to lift the spine closer to the ceiling if we're weight bearing on the floor here. So we're basically protracting the shoulder blades, moving them away from the spine, which means that this cue is aiming to tap into serratus anterior or serratus anterior, catching the inner borders of the shoulder blades and hugging them close to the rib cage. That feeling of really stabilizing the base of the shoulder complex in one place. Step 3 is to hug the forearms or the thumbs toward the midline, to kind of draw the arms isometrically, meaning without moving, toward each other, to get the front of the chest. And we don't really need to be more specific than that. We'd feel the pecs here on the chest, cooperating and coordinating to create some support for the front of the joint. And this last step, in my body at least, is the most difficult, but it's the most important, in my body at least, because this final step takes almost the opposite view. And all of these first 3, we've got these sturdy connections, these contractions on the front of the joint, the tissues that of the shoulders are the most familiar to us. And when we aim to balance that out by broadening the clavicles or broadening the collarbones or shining the sternum forward, what happens, even though we're cueing the more familiar front of the body, is that really important muscles on the back of the body engage, including the rhomboids running counter to serratus anterior, including infraspinatus. Remember that one muscle of the rotator cuff that sits on the back, well, along with teres minor, to take the head of the humerus back into the center of its socket. It's actually the antagonist to subscapularis, to create this really important counteraction of not just engaging the front of the joint, but waking up the back of the joint as well. So if I come to my yoga mat, find a plank pose, and then lower my knees so that there's a little bit less load running through the body. Step one is to take the head of the humerus and plug it down and in to the shoulder socket. And I'm sort of imagining here an almost diagonal action running through the head of the humerus and kind of snuggling it into the shoulder socket or packing it into the shoulder socket. So I'll be activating the muscle of the rotator cuff that's closest to the front body, the one that's on the front of the shoulder blade. And I might get a little through the lats or the latissimus as well, this sort of back strip of the armpit. If you're somewhere where you can come along with me, feel free to come down onto the floor and play to see how this feels. So step one is to hug the upper arm bone down and in to the shoulder socket. Step two is to keep that down and in action and then push the floor away or press the hands forward or stretch the skin between the shoulder blades or lift the rib cage toward the ceiling to take the shoulder blades and move them away from the spine and wrap them around the side ribs. Now we think of serratus anterior or serratus anterior as being a protractor, but it's also the muscle that's primarily responsible for countering scapular winging, when the shoulder blades kind of lift off the back of the body and protrude through the skin of the back, because they have that capacity to catch the inside of the shoulder blades and bring them closer to the rib cage. They're a really foundational support for the position of the shoulder blades. So step one, hug down and in. Keep that as you step two, press the hands forward or push the floor away. Keep both of those actions. And then for step three, hug the thumbs toward the midline or the forearms toward the midline. You might imagine trying to wrinkle the mat between your hands. And as you do that, you'll feel the front of the shoulder, especially the pecs, switch on. And with those three muscle actions in place, the front of the joint will feel really sturdy. You know, when we're in plank and we're doing push-ups, this is the part of the shoulder that tends to feel the strongest, that kind of vigorous contraction over the chest. This contraction of serratus anterior over the side ribs, a little less familiar, but this forward shoulder position for most of us, a pretty comfortable, strong, and sturdy place to be. So those three actions to some extent work together and play to our strengths of having the arms out in front of the body and the chest engaged. This fourth cue almost feels like the opposite of those actions. And so it's really challenging for many of us to find that dynamic balance. So step one was to hug down and in. Step two was to press the floor away. Step three was to magnetize the forearms toward the midline. And then step four is to broaden the clavicles or to shine the sternum forward. And you can see how that's almost the opposite in the sense that it starts to bring my shoulder blades a little closer to my spine. There's almost a feeling of rotating the hands out away from the midline or external rotation to take the head of the humerus and roll it back into the center of its socket. All of these actions bring the head of the upper arm bone forward. That fourth step centers it in its socket and adds support on the back of the joint. Infraspinatus and teres minor, the external rotators, also the rhomboids in between the shoulder blades and the spine. So while it's difficult to balance the first three, we feel kind of strong and purposeful and sturdy. As we start to broaden the clavicles, we're almost doing the opposite. And those two feelings can be difficult to reconcile, especially for those of us who are a little more mobile in yoga practice. As we shine the sternum forward, it can be really tempting to lose the support of the core and to come into a sort of saggy and relaxed back bend. And there's nothing wrong with that in yin practice, but if we're working plank, side plank, chaturanga, or an arm balance, we want to keep that sturdiness. And so that's the most interesting place for many of us to play, to find that strength and structure on the front of the joint, and then create the capacity to balance that out by creating this subtle activation on the back of the joint as well. So that rather than the head of the humerus sitting forward of the glenoid fossa, it snuggles a little closer to the center. Something that's really worth playing with in your practice to see if you can find that sense of dynamic balance. And for a lot of us, that means turning the volume down. So if you're starting in a full plank with your knees lifted and you're creating all of those muscular contractions really vigorously and then shining the sternum forward, you might lose the subtlety, the nuance that's required to get all of these muscles, many of them pretty small and deep, to switch on at the same time. So I would recommend starting at 80% of your muscle contraction, come out, have a break, try again at 50%, come out, have a break, try again at 30%, and see if you can just dial the volume down enough to feel this very subtle sense of support around the shoulder joint, but not the big, vigorous contraction that you might feel it in big superficial muscles like your quads or your glutes, for example. Turning the volume down until you can create a feeling of balance and harmony and not rigidity. So, something to play with, I think, for most of us in our practice there. So, a reminder, this first step, to hug the head of the humerus down and in this sort of diagonal movement to pack the joint a little closer together. Primarily subscapularis, the front of the rotator cuff, but some participation from other muscles as well, including the latissimus or the lats. Pushing forward or pressing forward or pushing the floor away or lifting the rib cage is scapular protraction, moving the shoulder blades away from the spine, primarily serratus anterior or serratus anterior, this very crucial stabilizer for the base of the shoulder complex, that scapulothoracic joint. Step 3 was to magnetize the hands toward the midline. Obviously, if they're on the floor or the wall, they can't move. So it's isometric. It's an energetic contraction without creating movement. The switch on the front of the joint, primarily the pecs. And then that fourth step, so crucial to balance out those 3 actions and to recreate this sort of harmony around the joint, not just the front, not just the sides, but the back as well. This broadening of the collarbones or lifting of the heart or shining of the sternum forward to get a little bit of retraction, to get the rhomboids to switch on at the same time as serratus anterior, to get that little bit of external rotation, almost that feeling of turning the pinky fingers out to send the head of the humerus back into its socket, switching on the external rotators, including Infraspinatus and teres minor, to create this sense of dynamic balance. And for a lot of us, that will be difficult to do for the first time with our body weight fully on our hands. So the easiest way to practice that action is to dial back the body weight and bring our hands to the wall. So that instead of having all of our body weight, we've got a little bit of a connection with the wall, but less load running through the joint, a little bit easier to turn the volume down. Once we have the knack of that, we can try it on all fours. Once we have the knack of that, we can try it in plank. Chaturanga becomes more challenging because we've taken the stability away from the straight arm. We've bent the elbow. There's that tendency for gravity to kind of sit on the back of the shoulder and push the head of the shoulder forward. So practicing that action with straight arms is a great way to keep that stability when we start to bend the elbows. Side plank, another great place to practice because it already has a little of that broadened clavicle, a little bit more of that central position of the shoulder. We could imagine turning the hand toward the pinky finger edge to create that little bit of external rotation, almost imagined external rotation that switches on the back of the rotator cuff. And then progressively adding more challenge would be to add more body weight, inversions, arm balances, for example. So lots of places to play with that central shoulder position on the yoga mat. But the important part, I think, for most of us is what we can take from that off the yoga mat. So let's talk about some of the common patterns in the shoulder muscles. We'll talk about it in theory first and then a little bit more practice after that. Firstly, the anterior shoulder, the front of the shoulder and the chest tends to be a little tighter or stronger or more familiar or more easily engaged, while the back of the shoulder, the posterior shoulder muscles tend to be a little bit more weak or less familiar or more inhibited from action. And to a large degree, that's natural because most of the time our arms and hands are in front of the body. I'm not going to knit with my hands behind my back. I'm not going to drive with my hands behind my back. I'm not cooking with my hands behind my back. So to some extent, this forward shoulder position is natural. It's dictated by function, our hands needing to be dexterous where our eyes can see them, in front of the body. But modern life tends to exacerbate this because in ancient times, our lives had a little bit more movement variety built into them. We weren't always sitting on computers or holding devices or holding steering wheels or sitting in couches. Our arms were being used in more varied positions. So the patterns of modern life can, for a lot of us, accentuate this pattern of anterior shoulder tension, posterior shoulder inhibition. Another theoretical pattern that we tend to see is that when smaller, deeper muscles like the rotator cuff aren't doing their functions the way we'd like them to, muscles that are closer to the surface, more superficial muscles, can kick in to try to compensate. So I spoke about the traps, the upper traps here on the top of the shoulders. There's another muscle that often gets mistaken for the upper traps called levator scap, running from the base of the skull to the top corner of the shoulder blade. These are two really classic superficial shoulder / neck muscles that tend to turn on when we're not great at firing those deeper structures. And you might have seen that in me, even when I was weight bearing on my hands, trying to get the shoulder to function. You might have seen the upper traps kind of springing in to try to help. We can help, we can help. So those deeper structures, when they aren't doing their jobs, and that can be difficult if we are unfamiliar with those tissues and we don't know how to get them to fire. The superficial muscles that we are a little more familiar with might try to fire to help out, only ever trying to be useful. So commonly tight, the pecs, that major chest muscle on the front, the rotator cuff in general often feels tight. The triceps on the backs of the upper arms, the lats, this sort of back strip of the armpit, and the little teres muscles that run like mirror images there. The upper traps here on the tops of the shoulders or the sides of the neck, and the levator scapulae or levator, which runs pretty similar position to the upper traps, and they often get mixed up for each other. So these commonly feel stiff, tight, tense. Commonly weak, the rotator cuff. So I think we have this theory that a tight muscle is also a strong muscle, and a weak muscle will also feel nice and stretchy. But often the opposite is true, that when a muscle is really good at its function, it will engage very naturally, but it will also release very easily. And there's not a sense of it being either weak or tight. Often a muscle that's a little dysfunctional, that's trying too hard, won't be able to contract fully, but also will give us a feeling of tension when we try to get it to release fully. So it's not unusual to see the same muscle appear on both of these lists. So the rotator cuff can often feel tight if we get into a position that stretches it, but is often weak, especially these ones on the back of the joint. Infraspinatus was the one that I told you needed to remember on the back of the rotator cuff, that external rotator that pulls the head of the humerus back into its socket, commonly weak or inhibited from action. The scapular stabilizers, we spoke about the rhomboids as being ones that actually are usually pretty strong and easy to engage, but fatigue quickly. But especially serratus anterior or serratus anterior, the one sitting here over the side ribs that protracts the shoulder blades. For a lot of us, this is a thin, a broad sheet of muscle. It's not something that we feel contracting strongly like we would the biceps, for example. For me, I've got to close my eyes, I've got to poke out my tongue to really focus on getting that muscle to fire. So it's one that is commonly weak. And then the lower traps, the mirror image of these big, strong, beefy upper traps, their job being to catch the shoulder blades and pull them down toward the back of the waist, commonly weak as well. And so what we wind up with is a pattern that exists in many of us, not in all of us, we're all different, but in many of us, there is this pattern of anterior shoulder carriage, where the shoulder kind of goes past its natural tendency to sit a little forward of the center line of the chest. Remember, it's important that our hands can be out in front of us, and becomes habituated to this position. Kind of sits with the chest hollowed, the arms maybe rotated forward and moving forward of the midline. Often comes along with a rounded upper back. This sort of position, forward head carriage also commonly comes along with this. And that's something that we all know we get from looking down at our devices constantly. That pattern, that familiar pattern, tight pecs, tight lats, that back strip of the armpit, tight levator, this very noticeable stretch that you get when you kind of lean your head to one side or tuck your chin, like, oh man, that's so tight. I've been so tense this week. That really common pattern, which often goes along with the erectors, which run either side of the spine, sometimes called the paraspinals, being a little strained from holding the weight of the head in that forward position. And that pattern that I just spoke about of the back of the shoulder, especially the external rotators, the back of the rotator cuff and the rhomboids, serratus anterior, all being a little bit weaker. So we know we see this in poses like plank, front of the shoulder strong, that kind of position easy to create, and a feeling of vigorous contraction there becomes a lot more difficult for most of us to find that fourth step, that broadening of the clavicles or lifting of the chest or shining of the sternum forward to recreate a little bit more neutrality in the joint. Now, rigid military posture, pulling the shoulder blades back and shoving them down, is actually not the answer. So the answer isn't to get the back of the shoulder to really vigorously contract. Remember, right back at the beginning, we talked about the essential nature of the shoulder joints being high mobility. We need them to be elastic and pliable to allow us to move our hands through space, to do all the things we need our hands to do in life. So the nature of the shoulder complex is to be mobile, pliable, adaptable, to be able to move our hands. So the key isn't rigidly pulling the shoulders back or pushing them down. It's mindful awareness. It's an acknowledgement that the front of the shoulder and chest is probably always going to be a little more familiar, a little stronger, but with a little thought and care, we can tap into the balancing actions on the back of the body, that little bit of external rotation of the upper arm bones, that little bit of engagement between the shoulder blades on the back of the body to create that dynamic balance, that balance in opposition that recreates a more neutral position. And the idea isn't that we have to be in that engagement 24/7, but that we just take opportunities in our yoga practice and our life to take the arms and hands out of this shape and position. So that might be taking the arms into overhead positions, stretching the pecs, stretching the lats. It could mean some positions with the arms and hands behind the body, engaging the back of the shoulder and stretching through the chest. It could be having the arms do some functions behind the body, knowing that we don't need them to do that 24/7, but a little bit of that work can be a really helpful balance to the tendency for the shoulder to sit forward in its joint. So that might just mean if you're sitting at your desk for hours working away, that when you take a break, instead of stretching the muscles that might feel tight, you might reach the arms up overhead. You might externally rotate the arms and squeeze the shoulders back. You might clasp your hands behind you, or, as I said, get the arms to do some smooth gliding movements behind the body, just to recreate that balance and that pliability. So, as with most things in yoga medicine, there isn't a quick and easy answer. It's all about understanding the natural tendencies of your body and finding subtle little ways that you can play with that balance to recreate a little bit more harmony. In the Yoga Medicine 55-hour shoulder intensive, you'll obviously dive in a lot more detail. I just cherry picked a few different sections of the training to talk about the things that I think have the biggest application to weight bearing on the mat, which can be a challenge for these mobile joints. And then what we can learn from that, that sense of awareness of the back of the shoulder to help us with our posture and to ease out that sense of the superficial muscles getting tight because they're trying to do the work of the deeper structures. But in the Yoga Medicine 55-hour shoulder intensive, the idea is to equip you as a healthcare professional or as a yoga teacher or a really interested student to work with people one-on-one, to really dive into individual situations and scenarios, because many people will have forward shoulder carriage, but not everybody. For some, there's more of a tilt, the shoulder blade kind of tipping, bottom tips flaring out, top tips tipping forward. Some people have that sort of more rigid, more military posture. So to equip you to work with people individually, along with their healthcare providers, if they're working with a doctor or a physical therapist or another healthcare professional, to help them find a little bit more balance and harmony, or maybe to reduce their pain. So in section one, we get into a lot more detail in the anatomy. We talk a lot more about the bony structures and the layers of the synovial joints. You'll understand how the capsule functions, how the ligaments and tendons work. You'll go through a lot more layers of muscles. We'll dive into all of the muscles that I mentioned and more in quite a bit more detail. We'll then move on to take that theoretical knowledge and apply it to an individual student. How would you evaluate a student's static posture and movement? How would you evaluate which tissues feel tight, which tissues feel weak or inhibited from firing? They might be those common patterns, but people are surprising. They might be different between the two sides of the body. So to give you the tools to really work with people individually. We'll talk through some of the most common injuries that you'll see. Obviously, we can't diagnose or treat, but it does really help to have a bit of background awareness of what you might come across. Um, Even if it's just to understand a student who already has a diagnosed injury, what patterns you're likely to see, or what actions might be helpful to do or to not do. So a bit of that background knowledge, I think, can be hugely helpful. We'll then move into therapeutic applications, so specific practices for each individual muscle or each arm movement or position, kind of breaking it down into more granular detail so that you can, kind of like a smorgasbord, you can pick and choose the practices and the actions that you think will be most helpful for you or for your student. We'll put it all together so that you can look at the student not just as a shoulder joint walking around through life, but as a whole complex and complete individual. Maybe they don't need specific therapeutic actions for their shoulder as much as they do just restorative yoga and good breathing mechanics and the opportunity to rest. So a kind of bigger picture. We'll look at some individual case studies, which always helps to kind of take the theory, which is always fairly neat and tidy, and apply it to the messiness and complexity of people. And then a new section on prevention and durability, which means that even if somebody or you don't have an injury, even if you aren't experiencing any pain or dysfunction, you learn a little bit about future proofing your joints, creating strength and resilience that allow them to meet the challenges of life. So hopefully that whirlwind tour through the shoulders has piqued your interest. Kind of quick recap. Remember, the shoulders are multiple shallow joints designed to keep our arms mobile and these dexterous hands able to move through space. Now, we can train our bodies to do anything. You just look at the people in CrossFit or gymnasts who can be on their hands for minutes at a time, who can do handstand walking, for example. So we can train our bodies to do anything. But if we haven't put in that training, we can't assume that we know how to create stability here the way we can to some extent with the legs and the hips. When it comes to creating that stability for the shoulder joints, we've got two big moving pieces to snuggle into place: the shoulder blade moving around on the rib cage, and the head of the humerus or the upper arm bone moving around in relation to the shoulder blade. We had the rotator cuff muscles to juggle the position of the head of the humerus, small, deep muscles, not big, strong levers. They're really only creating, kind of initiating small movements. And then the bigger muscles that were moving around the shoulder blade, the rhomboids that retract the shoulder blades, and serratus anterior that protracts the shoulder blades. If we can get those two tissues to fire at the same time, we'll hold the shoulder blades in place. We looked at the 4 cues that you can use in your own body or to cue for your students to create that central weight bearing position when we're loading our hands, to hug the head of the humerus down and in, to keep that connection between the upper arm bone and the shoulder blade, and then push the floor away or protract the shoulder blades. To keep those two actions as we engage the front of the joint by hugging the forearms toward the midline and firing the chest. And then the most challenging, but in my body at least, the most important cue, that counter action of broadening the clavicles, shining the sternum forward, or lifting the chest without changing the shape of the lumbar spine, without losing the support of the core, but just creating that engagement on the back of the joint, this mysterious posterior shoulder. Balance out all the actions we created for the front. And that action, I think, is the most important one to play with when we're off our yoga mat. knowing that the shoulders are always going to sit to some extent forward of the body, how can we refresh the tissues on the back of the body, take ourselves out of the habits of modern life that really exacerbate that natural pattern of hands in front of the body, computer keyboards, devices, phones, and create that sense of relief and refreshment, even if it's just moving the arms around at the back of the body. And if you are interested in diving into about 55 times more information, then Yoga Medicine Shoulder Intensive might be for you. I teach a portion of that. My teacher, Tiffany Cruikshank, teaches the remainder. And there's a really lovely, robust exploration of nuance and detail. We'll kind of give you the neat and tidy theoretical applications, but there's always space to remember that people are unique and different and surprising, and to give you the tools that you need to apply the theory to individuals. Kind of pick and choose which parts of the model you think apply and which areas you think could benefit from focus. And as I said, there's always that reminder that this is a person, not a shoulder joint, and maybe what they need more than specific work on their shoulder is something else: movement, getting outside, fresh air. Maybe it's restorative yoga or meditation. So, a fascinating process to dive into. And for those of you who haven't done yoga medicine trainings before, an approach that I have found a little different to some of the other places I've studied. So this leaves me open to your questions. So you can pop them in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and I will jump in and answer them to the best of my ability. So we've got people from all over the world, which is fantastic, from the States, from Moldova, from Trinidad and Tobago, from London. Alison has asked about rehabilitating a shoulder with bursitis and rotator cuff tendinitis. So more detail than I can go into here. But what we're seeing here is bursitis. Itis means inflammation and irritation. The bursa is a little fluid-filled sac that sits within the joint, not just in the shoulder, but other joints too. And its job is to pad the gliding surfaces between the bones to reduce friction. And when it's irritated, it's painful, but it's not the cause, it's a symptom. Likewise, with tendinitis, it's an itis, it's an irritation or inflammation of the tendon. It's unlikely to be the cause as it is the symptom of a pattern in the shoulders. So with students who have those sort of irritated symptoms, I'd be looking at the patterns, the biomechanical patterns in the shoulders that have created that pattern, to see if you can find positions for the arms that ease the irritation or at least don't exacerbate it, and start to redress the balance. And that could be that really common pattern that I talked about of the shoulders drifting forward. Bursitis often comes from this overhead position, so it might be a slightly different pattern where the shoulder blade isn't gliding as freely as it should, and the bursa is getting squashed between the shoulder blade and the upper arm bone. So lots more that you could dive into there, but in general, look to avoid or limit irritation and then see if you can redress balance in the system. Vienna, yay. Yes, the shoulders are beautifully complex. For people who tend to hold tension in the shoulders, that's most of us, by the way. Most of the people that I talk to about their shoulders say, oh, I'm so tight in my shoulder, I'm so tense here. And they might still be very mobile people. Remember that tension in the superficial muscles can come from the superficial muscles trying to do the work of those deeper structures. So how would you begin to approach that in order to restore the vitality of the tissues? Strength, MFR, or something else? I would tend to follow the same approach of figuring out what's working too much, what's overly tight or overly active, what's not working enough, what's weak, what's inhibited, and try to pick maybe practices for each, or maybe just starting with one, whichever I think is going to be the most influential. So what could I strengthen that would allow that superficial tension to ease? Or do I need to use myofascial release or gentle stretches to ease that tension before there's space for the student to start to strengthen the tissues that should be working? Often I work with the two sides of it simultaneously, and myofascial release is a great tool to start with because it creates that sort of instant relief. People feel it, they get excited, it's working, and they're more open to do the longer term processes like strengthening that can help that pattern from recurring. The clavicle cue, that you learned from Tiffany saved a lot of pain in chaturangas? Yes. Same for me too, because the tendency we know is for the shoulder to sit forward. When we bend the elbows and add the load of gravity in chaturanga, even more of a tendency for the shoulder joint to sit forward. And a healthy, happy shoulder can do that. It could do that once or twice. It could do that maybe even once a day. But if we're doing 10 chaturangas a class, if we're doing 5 classes a week, if we practice for years, the things that we do repeatedly can start to create that inflammation or irritation that I spoke about. And it can be a helpful practice to find that more balanced position, even as we bend the elbows in chaturanga, which, by the way, means for most of us staying higher, shoulders above elbow height, to keep us at a biomechanical advantage, to keep that more central position for the head of the shoulder. It's also saved my shoulders from a lot of pain. Some of the motions you just showed generate clicking or grinding sounds in the socket. Is that from tight muscles or lack of lubrication in the joint, or a combo? Without further information, really hard to say for sure. If the clicking and grinding sounds create pain, I would avoid those movements and go and see your healthcare provider. If they don't create pain, then I'd be kind of curious to experiment. Maybe you could make the movements a little smaller and see if that bypasses that clicking or grinding. Maybe that sort of dialed down volume of muscle activation around the joint will create a difference. That would be something I'd be interested in playing with. Karen Fabian, hi Karen, from Boston, just wondering, the 4 cues, do they primarily apply to poses where you're weight bearing on the arms? Yes, 100%. When we're not weight bearing on the arms, we don't need to have a central and stable position. So when we're weight bearing on our feet and our arms are unloaded, we can do anything we like with the shoulder blades. We can bring them forward for eagle pose. We can take them back for humble warrior. We can reach them overhead. We can do Gomukhasana arms or writer's pose arms. So that central position is important when we have weight on our hands. When we're not weight bearing on our hands, remember their nature is to be mobile. So there's no need to keep that sense of kind of snuggling the shoulders into their joint when we've got the arms overhead in crescent lunge. We can just let the shoulder blades lift, reach up through the arms. So yes, when we're weight bearing on the feet, we can do whatever we like with the arms. I would still remember that kind of capacity to move around into more varied shapes and positions to keep the pliability and adaptability of the joint. Balanced protraction and retraction to stabilize the shoulder joint really resonated for you. That's fantastic. You could sort of visualize that sense of this muscle pulling them this way, this muscle pulling them this way. You get both to work together in that dynamic balance. And all of a sudden, you've got a stable position for the joint. And this works not just for the shoulder blades, but for pretty much everything in the body. For me, for example, I tend to hyperextend my knees. And if I can get the quads on the front of the thighs and the hamstrings on the back of the thighs to gently contract at the same time, for me, that creates a much more stable and supportive position for my knees. So co-contraction of those antagonist muscles can be really helpful to play with. Carrying on the Q&A, Q1 and 2 opposite movements. They actually aren't. I know it kind of feels like it. So Q1 is designed to work on the glenohumeral joint, taking the head of the humerus and snuggling it down and in to the shoulder blade. Thinking about this connection, this glenohumeral joint, snuggling it down and into the shoulder socket. We talked about subscapularis or subscap on the front of the joint. It's relating to here. And then the second cue relates to the shoulder blade itself. So we keep this connection and then we move the whole thing closer to the side ribs or away from the spine. So Q1, hug down and in, keep that connection, and then we move the whole structure away from the spine toward the side ribs. They kind of feel like opposites, but definitely possible to do the two at the same time, keeping the same relationship between the upper arm bone and the outer edge of the shoulder blade, and then moving the whole shoulder blade to wrap around the side ribs. So those two you can do at the same time. Then you add that hugging in through the forearms to activate the chest. Also easy to do at the same time. It's that last one that to me feels like the opposite, because as we get the back of the rotator cuff to engage, we're to some extent countering the front of the rotator cuff. As we get the rhomboids to engage, we are to some extent countering serratus anterior or serratus anterior. So getting that dynamic balance. something to play with in your practice, kind of visualizing the bones in your own body and imagining that you have a sort of X-ray vision. So play with those, Chandra, and see what you think. Brenda says, are we getting a copy of this PowerPoint? No, but you'll have this recording. So you can rewatch the recording and kind of revisit any of the slides that you felt warranted a little bit more attention. In downward facing dog, how should we position the hands to stabilize the shoulders? Now, again, it depends. It really depends on our individual anatomy, how we should position the hands. I can talk about my personal experience, but for each of us, it will vary a little. So in my personal experience, my hands need to be a little bit wider than shoulder width. And I'll have my index fingers pointing forward. Some people like the middle fingers. Some people like the thumbs. For me, the index fingers pointing forward. I'm letting the shoulder blades upwardly rotate. We talked about that very briefly at the beginning. The bottom tips of the shoulder blades moving toward the side ribs, the top tips of the shoulder blades moving toward the back of the waist. And I'm imagining a tiny little bit of external rotation, just enough to soften the upper traps, just enough to soften the sides of the neck, so that instead of my downward facing dog being here, there's that little bit of space between arm bones and ears. So in downward facing dog, a slightly different position from the one that we have in plank or on all fours. As we take the arms overhead, we've got a little bit more upward rotation of the shoulder blades. And so we need to allow the bottom tips of the shoulder blades to follow the pinky fingers out toward the side ribs. And as I said, it'll differ a little bit for everyone. Some people like the hands a little closer together, the fingers a little more further forward. Some people like the hands wider and the thumbs forward, or the hands turned out. So the hands will really vary. In terms of the shoulder blades, we're looking for upwardly rotated shoulder blades. In terms of the humerus, we're in flexion, a little tiny bit of external rotation. I hope that helps. I know that's a lot of anatomical detail to lay on you. And if we have time, could you please do Chaturanga and give us the cues that you would normally use? Yes, absolutely. I always have time for Chaturanga. That's not true, actually. I quite often leave it out of my practice just to balance out the shoulder joints. So Chaturanga is a challenge, as I said, because here with the arm straight, the arm itself is stable. So I can assume some stability here, and I'm just playing around with the head of the humerus and the shoulder blades. Once I bend the elbows, I've lost the stability that I had in the straight arm. And so there's more going on, more complexity there. The other challenge with Chaturanga is that it's happening pretty quickly. Usually it's just the out breath and we're on our way somewhere else on the in breath. So we don't have time as teachers to get a lot of cues out. We don't have time as students to take a lot of cueing in. So if this is something that you struggle with, I would recommend that you practice a couple of rounds of it slowly enough that you can really play with the knees down to reduce the load on the shoulders, so that when you get to moving at a bit more speed, you can just use a couple of cues as reminders, just quick refreshers. So I would start in plank. And if this felt like it was too much load for me or for my shoulders, I might come to plank and then lower my knees, head to the shoulders, down and in. Keep that as I push the floor away or protract the shoulder blades. Keep that as I magnetize the forearms toward the midline. Keep all of that, broaden my clavicles and shine my sternum forward. Notice that I didn't lose my core. It was just that subtle balancing position of the shoulders. Back to plank. Shift forward to tiptoes to get my core and quads to fire. Now I can lower my knees again and start to bend my elbows. So as I go slowly, I'm looking side to side to make sure that the shoulders don't round forward. That I'm keeping that broadness through my clavicles and that central position. And I should be able to find a point where I can bounce, not a push up, but just a little bounce, and I stay in my strength zone. And that's usually where I would keep my Chaturangas. And as I said, for most of us, to have the muscles at biomechanical advantage, our shoulder will have to be higher than our elbow. For most of us, most of the time. So once you've found that strength point, you could then transition down to the floor for Cobra, or you could just straighten the arms and lift the hips and thighs for upward facing dog. For a lot of us, this Chaturanga will feel really different. We're used to trying to get the heads of the shoulders quite low to the floor. and then to have to really pull the shoulder blades back and down to get to our back bend. So for a lot of us, doing chaturanga with this more central position will require us to be higher, shoulders above elbow height. But the nice thing is we already have the broad collarbones to take into our back bend. So we don't need to sort of reset the shoulders for cobra or upward facing dog. They're already there. So once I've had a little play slowly and I've given myself a chance to get the muscles to fire, to find that central position by glancing side to side, and you'll really see it, especially if you film yourself, the moment where the shoulders start to tip forward. And I've kind of landmarked my chaturanga. When I revisit, I would tend to go more quickly. So here's how it would go. I'd step back to plank. I'd do just 2 cues as a reminder. Push the floor away. There's that stable position for the shoulder blade. Shine the sternum forward. There's that posterior shoulder. Scoot forward to tiptoes to get the core and quads to fire. Bend the elbows. And then my chest is already in the position that I need for upward facing dog or cobra. And I can head back to downward facing dog. So as a teacher, if I'm teaching chaturanga, I tend to do a round or 2 slowly, setting up for plank, scooting forward, and then lowering the knees so that we have a little bit more strength, a little bit more time to play with the details. Bend the elbows, find that little bounce, find that place where you're in your strength, not a push-up using the triceps, but just to bounce without losing the central position for the shoulder. And I'd kind of landmark that as my chaturanga for class. And then when I come back, I just give 2 quick and dirty cues, press the floor away, shine the sternum forward, shift forward to tiptoes, bend the elbows. And then you've got that time in the flow of practice, and you're just reminding them of information that they've already found rather than starting from scratch. So lightning quick chaturanga dandasana tutorial. I hope that helped. On Yoga Medicine Online, we have quite a bit more detail for all of these shoulder actions. We've got tutorials for all the poses that dive in a bit more detail. So for those of you who are keen, you can head to Yoga Medicine Online, our online practice platform, and you can access a free week trial to give you a chance to test everything out. More questions with hyperextended elbows. Yes, that's me. In handstand, I see a lot of people balancing on hyperextended elbows, which scares me a little. Do the same principles from chaturanga apply here as well? Quick answer is no, because in chaturanga, the elbows are bent and gravity's pushing the head of the shoulder forward. So this is the load in chaturanga that we're trying to counter. And that's why that shining of the sternum forward is probably the most important cue, other than hugging the shoulder blades against the side ribs to counter the force of gravity. In handstand, the arms are straight, so we have that stability, and the load of gravity is running straight down through the shoulder joint into the upper arm, into the lower arm, down to the hand. So it's a little more similar to downward facing dog in the sense that the shoulder blades are upwardly rotated, tiny little bit of external rotation just to ungrip the sides of the neck. Arms are straight, and we're pushing the floor away. So because gravity's working on the joint in a different direction, different focal points and different cues apply. And you could kind of play with that co-contraction, biceps and triceps working a little bit to break the bend in the elbows. But to be honest, because it's so hard to balance in handstand, I don't know that many students would have the mental capacity or the physical nuance to do that without losing their handstand. For most people, I think it's enough just to get there and to try to stay there. So if you had someone who was very, very comfortable in a handstand, maybe you play with a micro bend in the elbow and a co-contraction in the biceps and triceps. But for most of us, just getting there is hard enough. Staying there is harder still. And because we're not there for long, I think less about hyperextended elbows than I do about hyperextended knees. Not because I think any harm is going to happen to the knees, but just because if we stay in our existing patterns, we're not teaching the body anything new. And when we have body weight running through the knees 24/7, maybe it's worth playing with some patterns that allow the load of gravity to transfer a little more efficiently from upper leg to lower leg. Most of us aren't in handstand anywhere near long enough for me to worry about progressive load to the elbow joint. That would be my take on it. Another question about inversions. In dolphin, the forearms feel very unstable on the floor sliding to the sides. Do you have any suggestions for this? Yeah, dolphin requires a pretty high range of motion. So if we're aiming to have the elbows at shoulder's width and we're trying this version with the palms flat to the mat, that requires a lot of capacity for external rotation in the upper arms, in the humerus, and also quite a lot of potential for pronation to bring the palms down toward the floor, this kind of rotation through the forearm. And not all of us have that range of motion. So for some people, it makes more sense to have the elbows a little wider, kind of more of a diamond shape, and then to use this hugging of the elbows toward the midline, this kind of anterior shoulder and chest firing to get the counter to that, to get them to stay together. I know a lot of people do it with a strap around the upper arms to train that hugging in action. So rather than pushing out against the strap, they've got the strap looped around the upper arms and they're trying to stay away from the strap or to keep the strap slack to train that hugging in through the front of the shoulder. If it's the forearms that are the challenge, you might be on the blades of the pinky fingers and perhaps have a block between your hands so that you take that movement challenge out of it and you're in a position that your shoulders find a little bit more capacity to be strong and stable in. So those would be my two tips. Try letting the elbows widen a little and energetically hugging them toward the midline using the pecs. You could try staying away from a strap or keeping a strap slack. And if it's more the forearms that are the challenge, maybe you try it with the pinky fingers on the mat and you're holding a block between your hands to, again, give you that hugging in action to stop the feeling of the elbows sliding away. It requires pretty high range of motion, so it's not a surprising one to see people struggle in. There is a lot of fatigue, says Christina. Yes, yes, there is, because remember, it's not natural to bear weight on our shoulders. Now, we can train the body for anything, but we can't assume that our students can load their upper bodies for a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes, the way we can really assume that they can stand on their feet for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. And so when we practice, it's natural that the shoulders and chest and upper back would fatigue a little more quickly than the muscles of the hips. And we need to remember that when we're teaching. I think that's all the questions. Yes, fantastic. If you're looking for any more information, feel free to reach out to me, Rachel Land, and feel free to reach out to Yoga Medicine. You can email Katie info@yogamedicine.com for any information about the shoulder intensive and what information will and won't be covered there. We're constantly refining our trainings. So each time we run through it, the questions that come up, the conversations that are generated, the information that we gather from you, from the participants, really does fine tune what we offer the next time around. So every training is a little bit different, and there'll be lots of really practical tips like this one, the 4 cues to play with. There are some little magic tricks that we work on with the shoulders to create more freedom in that overhead arm position and that upwardly rotated shoulder that can be difficult for a lot of us and create that inflammation and pinching and bursitis that we spoke about earlier. So it's one that as a teacher I found really helpful, because often when people have an injury to their back, they just won't come to yoga. But when they have an injury or irritation in their shoulder, they keep on coming. So as a teacher, just being armed with a little bit of information and some tools that you can employ, I think is hugely helpful. Well, thank you so much for your participation. This has been really fun. I appreciate your time. And as I said, any questions, reach out. Thank you very much. See you all in time and space.